welcome to our webinar with the Society for the Advancement of Consulting and the Supply Chain Special Interest Group with global experts. And we're going to be talking today about supply chain partnerships, creating resiliency in 2021. So there's plenty to talk about when it comes to this topic. I'm going to introduce our panel, and then I'll get the conversation started. And then the panelists can always add something to the intro as they would like. These are our panelists. I'm Lisa Anderson. I'm the moderator. I'm from LMA Consulting Group and have been in the supply chain industry for 30 plus years at this point. We also have with us today Evan Bulmer from Adelaide, Australia. And he is an expert in finance as well as supply chain and manufacturing. And then we also have David Ogilvie. And David Ogilvie is also from Australia, but he's from Brisbane, Australia. And he is an expert in supply chain and ERP systems and the use of technology to achieve manufacturing objectives. And then Dave Gardner is not with us today, but he's with us in spirit because he's recovering from surgery. And then we have Diane Garcia. And Diane Garcia is from Portland, Oregon. And she is an expert in, has worked with many aerospace firms and has expanded into several other areas of consumer products and building products, and has a lot of planning and supply chain management expertise. So we're excited to have these global experts with us today to talk about the topic of supply chain partnerships. As we kick this off, supply chain partnerships have been evolving, and they're continuing to evolve with the pandemic. So the pandemic put us into a whole new world, and it's come to the point where the supply chain was highlighted. Suddenly, everyone knew what the supply chain was about, or at least they knew that it was important because they weren't getting the supplies they needed, including toilet paper in the US as an example. I had countless calls from reporters on toilet paper, but we've gotten beyond that, thank goodness. And there are still much volatility going on in the supply chain. The demand and the supply have gotten out of alignment, and it's very tricky to realign those. But more importantly, what does this mean for businesses? And we're going to talk about that. What's the state of business in Australia? What's the state of business in the US and some of the other surrounding areas? But really, as a high-level background, the companies across the globe were focused on cost for the last many years. They were outsourcing to low labor cost countries. They were implementing lean programs. Pretty much they were sourcing with cost in mind at the 80-20. Their focus was on efficiencies and cost largely. The last several years, Amazon has come on the scene, Alibaba in China, but Amazon really has changed the thought pattern to where customers and quick responsiveness have become the standard in terms of Amazon-like service, regardless of who it is that you're supplying. And the pandemic, then we had the tariffs, which caused us to have a little bit of concern, at least in the US, about, from a cost point of view, what was happening on that front. And then we went into the pandemic. And that's when we all know what happened there. But it certainly has changed the game. And we have realized that we have to be resilient as well as interested in our cost. Because if we aren't resilient, it does not matter what the cost is. So now we're entering this phase here where cost and resiliency are important. And then on top of the executives' minds, with all the clients that I'm working with, both big and small, global and local, is how do we do what we're doing, not only from a cost point of view to be cost effective and resilient, but how do we do it fast and get there before the competition? More companies will be successful and pull ahead of the pack during this period of time than in any other time, like during our lifetimes of anyone on this call or anyone watching it in the archives. So it will be, so that's what we're here to talk about today. As we reconfigure supply chains, we think about potentially, like in the US, we're talking a lot about reshoring and the possibility of reshoring and nearshoring. But as we start to think about our relationships differently from our end-to-end supply chain, that could be customers, suppliers, employees, logistics partners, technology partners. As we start to think about our partnerships differently for the future, that's what the topic is going to be about today. How do we set ourselves up successfully so that we can succeed? So with that preamble, if you will, I'm going to ask Evan to give us an update on what things are like in Australia. How dependent are, how dependent are they on China, and what's, what is the state of the supply chain and the manufacturing up in that end of the world?
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. I mean, obviously, over conversations with you guys over the last sort of 12 months, America's talking about reshoring and bringing, factories back to the US as a strategy. That's just not going to happen in my country. And we're 23 million people. And, our last car manufacturer walked out the door. It was GM, a year or two ago, David,
Yeah.
That's not coming back. We've had all of our supply chains massively disrupted. And so, what do you end up doing? Being very strategic about what you purchase, because having the thing was critical. Selling the thing wasn't a problem. Think about it. Services have sort of stopped being purchased, like overseas trips and stuff. And so people start spending their money on cars and what have you. So, the purchase of products has gone through the roof and we can't get them. Well, that usually creates a big supply and demand divide. And so there's massive price taking, profit taking in some industries right now, and rightly so. We've got absurd situations at the moment where certain brands of Toyotas are worth more than when you bought them 2 years ago. Such is the weird thing that's happening. So what I see is, from a strategic point of view, businesses are spending a lot more money right now on personnel and tactics and strategies and relationships in order to shore that up. And so the idea of, for example, being efficient with inventory to save cash flow, which is something you might have talked about 2 years ago, is gone. We'll spend whatever it takes to get that key ingredient, key product, key component, key whatever, and have it, because we know we're going to sell the stuff. Demand is through the roof. You guys are sitting on piles of cash. So are we. Our government spent 10% of its GDP, pumped $130 billion into 25 million people. There are the haves and the have-nots. The ones that got taken out, like travel industry, airlines, smashed. Construction industry, through the roof, boom time. Car industry, through the roof. So it's been interesting. Now I say, if you want to think about the future, you have to take advantage of this boost that you're given. It's a boom year for some of these companies. They're cashed up. If they are not strategic now about what they do going forward, to take advantage of what I think is going to be growth for the next decade as everyone settles down and we start traveling again, and the roaring 20s reinvents itself 100 years later. If you're not ready for that, then yeah, you're going to miss out, I say.
So,
how's that, Lisa? Is that all right?
Absolutely. It's a great introduction. There's a lot to talk about in this webinar. So no, thank you. From that point of view, Diane, we were talking earlier today in the US and really in Canada as well. There's, we had a really strong economy pre the pandemic, and we've rebounded faster than any other countries have already. And so I think we've gained some momentum there. And I know, what are you saying, Diane, in terms of what's happening in the US and how, what's happening with supply chain.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to, I guess, discuss there, but just in general, in terms of U.S. manufacturing, we've seen an upward trend, and I think into 2021 and to next year, 2022, we'll continue to see an increase in our manufacturing. And one of the things we were discussing earlier was well, to me, it's very exciting to see Biden release an executive order on American supply chains and doing kind of a deep dive into making sure our supply chains are resilient. Just like you mentioned, not only are we interested in cost, but we're interested in resiliency. And so for me personally, to see supply chain and my career and my expertise so in the spotlight within the last year into 2021 has been very, very interesting. And so I think what we're going to see in general, and kind of opposite of what Evan's seeing for Australia, is that we will be continuing to bring back capacity into manufacturing facilities into the U.S., increasing jobs in the U.S., and just trying to obviously maintain a competitive advantage into our supply chains.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I'm seeing across my clients is they've definitely just figured out that being too dependent on overseas product was by no means resilient. And it was very slow, and you're very dependent on all sorts of things that could go wrong, including a pandemic, but all sorts of port issues and world conflicts and other things. So what I'm seeing is that folks are really they're no longer taking a look at reshoring, they are reshoring. Now, are they going to reshore everything? Of course not. They're figuring out what makes sense to bring back to the US, and they also are utilizing the new agreement we have with Canada and Mexico. So the USMCA went into effect last year, and it makes trade attractive with our partners nearby. So, if there is a high labor cost product and it doesn't require immediate delivery, then, they're looking at Mexico as a potential partner. And from that point of view, they're also looking at technology, because if we can print it on the spot, if you will, with additive manufacturing, that's even better. And they're realizing they have to modernize their systems. So with that said, there's a study in this area that I am located in within Southern California, which has 10% of the warehouses across the US, and a strong manufacturing sector as well, because they coordinate together closely. And there was a study before the pandemic, and it said that the technology transformation that was coming by 2035, if we didn't do something to reskill our people, we would have a disaster on our hands in this particular area. Now, what's happened since the pandemic is what was going to happen by 2035 is happening now. So with that said, David, how does that apply in the PAC Rim area of the world, and what you're seeing in Australia as well, from a any of the topics I just talked about? But I know that you're an expert in technology, so.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. It's interesting. The technology space has absolutely boomed at the moment. Everybody that myself included, but everybody that I relate to, and all of the ERP vendors, they have never been busier. And I think what's happened is during the COVID sort of lockdown periods, when companies were doing a lot of introspective reviewing and so forth, they've discovered that they really didn't have the information they needed to make the critical decisions that they needed to make. And that has spawned a flood of inquiry around how do we improve this? How do we get technology to help us do this? And so, everybody in that space is really busy. But I would concur with Evan around the reshoring not really occurring here. Australia obviously imports a lot of things, and we are a victim at the moment of the shortages in the shipping and the containers and all of those sorts of things that everybody is experiencing. And so I think that's going to have a fairly strong upward pressure on prices. So I think people are going to have to start thinking about how they're going to manage inflation more than they have had to in the last sort of decade or so, or even longer. So that's going to be a consideration that people have to think about. And in doing that, because, as Evan said, people are buying all of this inventory and hanging on to it because they need it, they are starting to look for alternative sources of supply. And people are looking to places like Vietnam. I know a couple of my clients are looking at India. And interestingly, with the volume and the capability that supports the US in Mexico, I'm surprised more Australians aren't actually looking to Mexico, because it makes sense to me that our economies are so similar it wouldn't matter, and that if they are skilled and scaled up to support the US, that the Australians should be able to plug straight in there. I'm not sure that the shipping routes and so forth are really there to make that overly effective, but that could be changed in over time, I guess. But from a relationships perspective, I think that they've never been more important. And I don't think that enough executives have focused enough on building good relationships in the past. I think your point about everybody just jumping to low-cost environments and it all being cost-driven, the relationships suffered. And those that have got good relationships and have got good systems, good visibility, good planning, all of the business supply chain 101 things, companies that are doing that well are still continuing to perform really well in this environment. It's those that have let all of those 101 sort of activities within their business are the ones that are struggling to find, oh heavens, what do we do now?
Yeah, very true. And Evan, I could see that you wanted to say something in there, but David, just go ahead, Evan.
Just to David's point about, reliance on China is probably the reason we've never looked to Mexico. And if you'd asked me 12 months ago, 6 months ago, I would have said there's no appetite in this country to shift from China. But China's behaviour to our country in post-pandemic has really shown them to be quite aggressive towards us. We've had shipments of product just stopped and turned around. Whole industries just stopped. China just stops buying because the government says so. So it's hurting industries, and people are hurting from that. But Australia has been this small country on the arse end of the planet that's had to wheel and deal and what have you. And so there's been some unintended consequences that have been very good for us. We have found new markets. We have found support in other countries, including the US, in terms of buying and working with us. So I see this as brilliant in the terms of we were over-reliant on China and we thought China could be, a safe country to play with, and it's not. And the average punter in Australia now understands that. And they did not understand that 12 months ago. They do now. And I don't think that sentiment's going to change. So that's been a massive shift in terms of how I would speak about this in 6 months.
And that's that behaviour, people understanding that business about China and how detrimental they are to our economy is now starting to flow through to their individual purchasing decisions. So when they go shopping, they are starting to make different purchasing decisions. And, with this business about driving to low cost, I've always blamed the consumer, because at the end of the day, if they had a choice between this product and this product, they always chose the cheap one. And therefore, companies had to go that way. So at the end of the day, this is a reflection of the consumer's behaviour. And now that they are more educated from a political perspective about how dangerous China are from us on that scale, people are starting to make different decisions, and therefore companies need to then shift along with their customers' decisions.
Yeah, we actually had on a webinar that's a partner organization to SAC for this particular webinar. It's the Association for Supply Chain Management. We had a webinar with an expert in China and Mexico, and he said that by all means, he doesn't expect everybody to leave China with their full volume like immediately, but by no means would he recommend that anybody look there, because there are just way too many risks. There was an IP law that was put into effect about a year ago that pretty much says if you send something to a server in China, which is pretty much anything, then it can be reviewed by the government, which pretty much means that, whatever you say is known by everybody in China. That's one thing.
That's exactly right.
Exactly. And then the other thing is that they just, they can decide that, the Olympics are coming. We don't want to have pollution, so we're going to shut down manufacturing across the board for a month. And just that's just what happens. So they can just decide what they want to decide. And it has a ripple effect throughout the supply chain. So there's just a ton of risks, is in essence what he was saying. So I completely agree. I'm seeing clients move to, it depends, they're reevaluating their supply chain partners. If they have low cost products that are lightweight and it's still okay to ship long distances, then they're definitely looking at Vietnam. And I'm actually seeing a lot of interest in India as well. And now they're looking more at Central and South America because those are closer, as well as Mexico. But certainly Mexico is on fire in terms of being a strong partner. And they're also just looking at, like, should we just bring it back? Because if you look at the total cost of ownership, it adds up, and it may make sense just to produce it locally. There's actually a significant trend to a local and regional basis. So that's what I'm seeing. How about you, Diane? Are your clients looking at alternatives from China as well?
Yeah, I agree. The only note I was going to add to that is one of my clients, they are transitioning over to receive products from India, from an Indian supplier. But of course, everything takes time and takes longer. And so they're still in the transition of it. And lead times are extremely long, especially for these casting items that they would need to bring in. So in some cases, if you haven't started reevaluating, there's quite a bit still to do to develop these relationships and these strategic partnerships in the supply chain, because it does take a lot of time to transition over. But yeah, the areas I would agree with, Vietnam, India, Mexico in some cases, especially when it's related to the United States, are top common sources.
Yeah. Yep. I think actually, David, you might be just progressive, and really what you're predicting as far as looking at Mexico for Australia as well is, you might be just a year ahead of the times, which is a great place to be, because like Evan said, it looks like they're reevaluating. And this group of supply chain
I still say this, Lisa, wait, give me another year or two, right? We're past it. And the consumer is back with the choice.
Yes. That's what's going to start it.
And I reckon when they're back with the choice, I can get the Chinese one for $5 and the, Mexico one for $7.50, or, the US one for $10.
Yeah, that's true. So I think that it's going to drive.
I'm concerned, mate, that they'll forget and go back. And that's the bit that I'm interested in. But
it'll be interesting to see. I think you're right. I mean, for sure, in some cases, if you're a pure commodity product, that's where you're going to have a problem. And it may not be China, though. It could be Southeast Asia. That's where the Vietnams and the South Americas could easily come into play. But I do see that companies that have some sort of a value add component are going to seriously consider what's strategic to their success and what's not. There was a book.
Here's the one that I find interesting. So you think about strategic stuff, right? And you think about even pandemic and vaccines. As I understand it, I'm not an expert in this area, but as I understand it, and talking to people who are, the base ingredient for most of this stuff came from China anyway. So you could try and source it somewhere else, and you're still buying Chinese stuff just from a different country.
There is definitely critical materials that are sourced from China currently, and there are other options and sources. But and actually, our China expert on the webinar a month ago was talking about that. I forgot what he calls them. I don't know. We'll just call them critical materials that are hard to source outside of China and places like that.
It's the active ingredients in pharmaceuticals. They're made in either China and there is a regional supply out of India. But the issue I see with India, of course, is it's a democracy.
Yes.
Right? Things take longer. There's more bureaucracy and all that sort of business, right? China, the government would make a decision, they would make it happen, and it was done almost overnight. That's not going to happen in India, and it's going to take the Indians a lot longer to scale and get these things done because they're a democracy.
Well, and it's because of the infrastructure. They do have a long way to go in terms of the infrastructure and how you move things around the country and that sort of thing. On the other hand, there is a lot of there is a lot of interest and a lot of money pouring into looking at India as an alternative, because I think the pandemic, like what would have, like Evan said, a year ago, this wouldn't be possible. But now I believe that people are like putting more money and resources where their mouth might have been before, but they weren't doing anything about it. And there's some other, that you're talking about pharmaceuticals, but there's other key materials that are needed for electronics and other things. And there is some options in North America to get some of those materials as well, but it's just a matter of like will and desire to set it up. So I do think that people are going to start pursuing those avenues.
And I think there's a great opportunity for Australian companies here, because you're talking about, say, rare earths, for example, and Australia has got one of the biggest deposits of rare earths around.
Rare earths, that's actually what I was talking about.
Yeah,
Thank you for coming up with the word.
And all we're doing is digging it out of the ground and sending it off. There's a great opportunity in Australia for us to actually deal with those things.
Absolutely. Talk about changing your negotiating position.
Exactly, and add value to it. There's great opportunities here for that, but whether it's happening or not, I'm not quite sure. At this point in time, I can't see a lot of evidence in it.
Well, I think that I think that now is the time where the countries that think strategically, the executives that think strategically and are thinking China thinks like years and decades down the line.
Yep.
Which is not at all what we've traditionally done in the US. But I believe that we are thinking longer, like the smarter executives will pull away from the pack and are thinking longer term. And we are doing more, like actually Operation Warp Speed in the US was a great example of public-private partnership. And what we did, I just found out some of the details recently, and I was really quite excited about this because it's exactly what I think should happen. But we actually planned for success, not only in vaccine development and contributing funds and resources to that, but on the supply chain and manufacturing side, we built plants before the vaccine was like approved or even known would work. We built plants, we expanded facilities, we built the logistics infrastructure, and we got the resources together. And very importantly, we actually purchased materials that were strategic to production of the vaccine in advance. So I have to say that's like brilliant. Operation Warp Speed is the reason that we have as many people vaccinated and are on a quick road to recovery here. So it's just an example. Like executives that do that in the future are going to be successful.
So, I was going to say, so quickly running down that rabbit hole, that Operation Warp Speed, what sort of incentives did the government give organisations to make those investments? Because if it's just left to the market, they're probably not going to do it until the consumer's demanding it. So that's the problem, right?
You're right. We did give significant investments to those organizations to do it, but we also started the process rolling. Like let's hope we can continue. But there was more of a private-public partnership, and it also involved, like all sorts of partners. Like just on the logistics side, like there was like UPS built, like they have already farms with like refrigerators, if you will, from a logistics point of view, on the West Coast. And so they were using already existing assets. And then McKesson is a key distributor of vaccines. Or I should say they're a key distributor that went to all the places that vaccines would have to go. And so they set up that relationship in advance, even though like Pfizer didn't want to didn't use that approach, but they were ready to go. So they started working on the next one. So, I mean, that type of thinking, well, does it mean you're absorbing some risk because may not all work out? Sure. But it also means that you can hit the ground running. And I think that things are going really quick today. So I think it's just an example. So I didn't necessarily mean to get us down
Well,
the.
I agree
Go ahead,
with
Diane.
in terms of they took the risk, or they tried to minimize the risk. And of course, with the relationships, they said, we'll go ahead and buy, knowing that maybe not all of these will be successful, but because they built a partnership and they had trust in that, they were able to, like you said, hit the ground running, or take off right as the vaccines were approved. So it did pay off very big.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, if we think about that from a supply chain partnership point of view, what do you all see as and take any of the above topics, but could be changing relationships with customers, changing relationships with distribution, logistics partners, suppliers, other outsourced manufacturers and employees. What do you,
Lisa,
go ahead, Evan.
If you accept that no strategy pre-pandemic can work post-pandemic, if you accept that proposition, then I say, of course, relationships with customers has to change. And it is changing. How businesses deal with customers has been critical when those customers just disappeared. You get real sharp at, changing tact, or, effecting change in your business fast. Everyone's accepting of change at the moment. If you want to run a new system through your business, now is the time, because everyone's eyes are wide open and change is just, way more accepted now. So I say, of course, this is a wonderful opportunity. The average, if you weren't smashed by it, then the average business is more cashed up today than it was before. Most governments have stimulated economies. Most economies are bouncing back to pre-pandemic levels and beyond. Here we go.
Stimulated, yeah. Well, and actually, our other half of our supply chain global experts that were focused on European and North America topics. Europe is having a very similar reaction, if you will, to the US, in the sense of they had the same issues. They're thinking about reshoring and nearshoring closer to where they are. So like what I heard is, in essence, that throughout the world, this is probably one of the only times when everyone has been through the same situation. So to your point, Evan, it's now is the time to take advantage, and customers' requirements have changed. Like at least 25%, 50% of what was happening before is completely changed. So like thinking about what was happening 5 years ago, 1 year ago is like irrelevant.
I mean, in my city at home, in Adelaide, if you owned a coffee shop in the city, it was boom time 12 months ago, because there was a renaissance back to living in the city in my town. I don't know why you'd want to do it personally, but people do. Those businesses are shot and they're not coming back. They're now trying all sorts of incentives to get workers back to the city. They don't want to come, mate. They've now tasted the hybrid lifestyle. So have customers, by the way. They're
Still
sitting
have
on
employees.
their computers buying a different way. Like if you it's fantastic, but if your head is in the sand, or if you're trying to, you'd be insane to keep doing things the same way, would it not? In this environment, insane.
That is very true. And actually, Diane, what are you seeing from that point of view as far as the hybrid idea or the virtual experience? What are you finding?
Well, I find that it's working. I mean, I think that it was a little bit of a shock in some cases to some clients, or maybe to some organizations, but we've proven over the last year that it works. And Evan and I and Lisa were having a conversation, so I'll contribute this to Evan's thought, but executives and leaders who are thinking about the future really need to think about more results driven instead of like more of a productivity driven mindset. And I think that as we've all been able to work and we've all experienced the pandemic to some degree in the same way, and a hybrid work environment is is the future, and I don't see us going back either into just all in person. Now I think there's going to be a boom and we have I guess a striving or a longing for being back in person. But once things kind of stabilize, yeah, I think hybrid is here to stay.
Yeah,
I think the reason for that is you're creating autonomy for the individual.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Right? And if you're going to create autonomy for the individual, then you've got to have an outcome-based conversation with them.
Yep.
Because
And
you're not sitting there lording over them in some way in an office, or controlling processes in a way, or whatever you do in that kind of environment, which was a management system that won't work very well in a hybrid world.
Well, and the thing with the pandemic is it really allowed the priorities to kind of rise to the top. And so, people, they took action and they decided what was my priority? What are the things that are going to move, my partnerships and my supply chain forward, and the rest of it's going to have to go by the wayside. So I think, people have proven that the hybrid model does work.
very good.
So, no doubt.
From a technology perspective too, the fact this everybody going to Zoom or Teams or whatever particular product they use, there's a lot of ERP systems that have been cross-country and globally implemented using all of these sort of technologies. Now, it has created new challenges. Knowledge transfer is a lot more difficult in this manner rather than belly to belly and face to face. And so there will be a sorting of that out. But what it has proven is that you don't have to be in an office. You don't have to be there. So you're changing the relationship that you have with people. You're changing the incentives that you need to have in place. You're changing the way that you're measuring outcomes and all of that sort of business. So change is all over the place at the moment.
I find this one interesting, guys. You talk about Zoom and what have you, and it's been around for a long time. We just all use it now, But there's virtual reality technology. So, I work with a training group here in Adelaide who's pioneering this stuff. And instead of sending young kids into, 3-story work sites to get electrocuted or smashed with stuff, they put on the VR glasses and they walk them through these dangerous environments in real time, but in the safety of, you can imagine their home.
Yeah.
So it's got to grow from here. Just much more acceptance. I can see a time when you want to consult to a factory and you can do a virtual tour of the bloody thing. You don't have to go there, or you can see a problem without getting there. Telehealth has gone nuts in this country. I don't have to leave my house to see my doctor, my psychologist, or anyone. They all come to me through the screen now. It's brilliant.
Go ahead, Diane. What were you going to say about that?
Well, I was just going to say I've worked with clients where from start of the kickoff project, it's actually been more effective to be online and doing these video calls, because you can record and return back to kind of the priorities of what was mentioned in the meeting. You can do these virtual tours and you can meet the team, and it's very effective to do that.
I don't think you can build relationships this way. I think the one thing you need to do is go, for example, if you're talking about a supplier relationship and, CEO to CEO, for example, might be an important relationship. At some point, they probably should be face-to-face. There's something about body language and eyeballing and shaking hands, all that kind of stuff that I think matters. But implementing can happen over Zoom all day long. Once the relationship is established, you can do this forever.
Yeah, you can maintain the relationship this way. It's difficult to create it in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this leads to one of the tenets of successful clients is a culture of innovation, which, this is what we're talking about here, is how do you continuously innovate and evolve with changing customer conditions and, make changing customer conditions, if you will, so that you can find new markets and opportunities, is what it sounds like. Which kind of leads me to one of the other areas that I've seen take off here, and that's e-commerce. Certainly, as everyone was at home,
and free time.
B2C shipping direct to the house has exploded, and clients that are in that arena has gone off the charts. They can't even keep up at all with the
That's
volume. But the
that's
same's happening in the business side for B2B is that drop ships, which is the same thing. It's just you're drop shipping it to a business, but you're shipping small quantities is taken off here. David, it sounds like you're seeing the same.
Yeah, well, Australia Post, our major carrier for that, and its business exploded with e-commerce. They are just creaking at the seams now. They just cannot cope with the volumes. And there was lots of stories over Christmas where parcels not arriving in time and all that sort of stuff. And so those logistic companies are under a lot of pressure at the moment, and there's great opportunities there for startups and things to fix this, because we just need more capacity because the business has just increased so much.
Yeah. And how about you, Diane? Are you seeing
I'm seeing the same thing. It's interesting to watch in the last year where, different industries are kind of bottlenecking or seeing, such a spike in their demand. And e-commerce, especially like you described it, it's exploded. And so clients are, they have this huge uptick in demand, and they really need to have their platforms able to support these orders and obviously make it easier on the customer to place an order with them. So it's been very interesting. I talked with supplier or technology suppliers on the phone, and just the common theme ever since the end of last year has been we're busier than ever in the technology realm.
One of the things I've noticed, though, because like everybody, I've made more use of it myself personally as well. The track and trace technology behind it all seems to be creaking at the seams as well. It's not up to date. It's not timely. It's not accurate, and those sorts of things. So, from a technological perspective, there needs to be some more work done in those sorts of areas to make this velocity, the ability to improve the visibility and the velocity of these things. There's work to be done there.
Well, and actually there's some significant projects going on with the LA and Long Beach ports, which take in 40% of the volume plus for the whole, for the entire United States. But what those projects are is, I think it's the port optimizer, at least that's what it used to be called. But in essence, what that means is, can you see what's on what ship, where on the ship, so that you can coordinate resources and figure out how you most efficiently, see what's getting visibility into what's coming into the port, what's at the port, where it's at the port, so that you can not just be efficient in getting it off, but more importantly, how do you increase the turnaround time? Because right now we have, I was just on a call this morning about the state of the ports, and there was between 45 and 60 ships that are outside of the ports waiting to get in, and there's more in the ports, and they don't expect it to ease up until the summer. But even at the summer, that's when the peak season starts, and the peak season is never going to end, according to all the experts in logistics. So I think we have a new next normal, or whatever we want to call it.
And that's actually a very complex combination of things to optimize, because there's the whole thing around having the containers in the right position for a rapid onboard, offboard at the time. But there's also the consideration of where the weight is on the boat, on the ship, so that it's safe at sea, and all of those sorts of getting the weights optimized correctly for the voyage. That's a very complex jigsaw to solve.
Well, and I think that
from
leads.
Our point of view, sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
From my point of view, from a strategy point of view, all that means is you get more cash into the system to buy more shit while you wait for it to arrive, and you punt. That's what happens.
That's exactly right.
It's true. I mean, the volume has gone off the charts because everyone is looking to, how do I scale up rapidly? To your point, Evan, they're less worried about how much cash they have tied up in inventory. I mean, no one wants more than they have to, but they're more interested in throughput.
You just told me that from the shipping point of view, that is not going to be efficient for 12 or 18 months. It's just going to be chaotic, and maybe beyond that.
Well, and that just extrapolates the problem, Evan, too, because what you're doing is you're putting another crack in the bullwhip. because everybody's buying more to hold more. So then that just adds more effort and more.
I've got a manufacturer here that needs plastic bottles to put their chemicals in. And there's a worldwide shortage of plastic bottles, as you can imagine, because everybody has been making hand sanitizer.
Yep. As well as, drinking waters and other things that are in plastic bottles that's, been flying off the shelves.
From a strategic point of view, you talk about efficiency of supply chain. We just go and buy as much as you can when you can get it.
Yep.
And you dedicate purchasing officers to scour the world to get this stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm seeing that folks are much more interested in scaling up rapidly, increasing capacity and throughput. Like the more you can get through, obviously quicker, you basically scale up without even having to scale up. So how do you do all those things at once and maybe utilize technology to avoid some of the links in the middle. Because after all, if you have to, go through, if you start in Asia, you have a whole bunch of things to go through. You have multiple facilities, you have transportation, you have ports, you have time on the water, you have to get through the next set of ports, and you have like rail, and you have, there's like an insane number of activities that have to be coordinated. So leads you to reshoring as well.
And underpinning all of that, adaptive manufacturing is not growing at a fast enough rate to replace it.
Correct. Yeah, exactly. So, and if anyone has questions, feel free to let us know. But we've been having fun having an interactive conversation here. But it's very related. It sounds like we talked about customer relationships, and we did talk some about supplier relationships. But we talked about changing the source of supply. One thing that I would bring up is when I was a vice president of operations, had this purchasing director that worked for me who was awesome. And we fought the battle continuously with private equity folks and the people who dealt with cash, to Evan's point of view, to keep a backup supplier in play, because a backup supplier alone is not enough if you aren't using them, because they're not going to be there when you need them, which is what everyone found out during this pandemic. And if your backup supplier is located down the street from your other one, it doesn't help either. Like that would be like both of them being in Wuhan, or both of them being in China, or even China and India, because our European colleagues said they had that situation and still didn't do it any good. But in our case, we had a Brazil supplier, and that was the one that was less, cost less money. And then we had one in South Carolina, and we kept the South Carolina supplier going at 20% of our volume, which made no one happy from a cost point of view. However, we did it. And I credit Bill. So Bill is the one. With that said, though, when we did have a problem, we went on allocation, and we were not the big player in this market, but we did keep our supply going, and they ramped up. So, I think people are rethinking that from a supplier point of view. Does anyone have any?
Whole relationship piece, isn't it, right? So you don't have one strategy for every item that you have, and you shouldn't have one relationship strategy for everything that you've got. You need to do what's right for each of the segments that you've got. There should never be a one fits all strategy, and that then I think also ties to what KPIs or measurements the organisation is using, because we all know that a KPI will influence behaviour. It'll have unexpected consequences around behaviour. And so it's picking the right measurement. And my question, I guess, is what measurement do you use to tie to your relationships? And for me, the key KPI to use is EVA, economic value added. So are we adding value to the business on a monthly basis, or are we subtracting value from the business? Because if you've got those dual supply relationships and supply sources in place, they add value to the EVA. And it's probably the one measure that helps us bring all of this together.
I think Evan probably has something to say about this, because it's I think metrics can drive results. Do you agree, Evan?
Oh, look, sure they can, but there's plenty of examples where metrics alone will destroy company culture. Because you get bad behaviour, people going for bonuses, ripping off customers, whatever. So it's always a balance to me of that and the strategy, So I take David's point, I think it makes perfect sense to me to have, multiple relationships going with key supply. To me, that's just, business 101 negotiation, to me, maybe we're, in Australia, we're a bit more used to getting cut off at different points in time. And so we're just a bit more savvy around that. But you would never, you just wouldn't, you would not have a business with one customer.
Right.
That's dumb. Why would you have a business with one supplier?
Well, I agree, but it's interesting, and like David pointed out, it is different based on what for your C items or something, like who cares? But
and I also think, generally speaking, the difference between America and Australia, if I think about it, is you guys are just a way bigger market, and you are demand driven. You are self-driven by your own demand.
Yeah,
we're not. If you are any kind of scaled business here, you are exporting. Because generally speaking, local demand won't cut it for you.
Because the big difference between our two countries, I think, is the US. Any company can make a really good living and be very successful within a very small niche because of the population and demand. In Australia, we just do not have the population. So even our mid-sized organisations have got very broad functional requirement footprints. They have to do a lot of different things for a lot of different customers. And that's one of
purely even from the consulting point of view, David, we noticed this. You and I are a bit more general because you kind of have to be. You've got to understand all parts of the business. You've got to be across the whole lot because you can't make a living just in one part. In the US, you can specialize in. I just work with companies that make these kinds of cups in red, and there'll be 25 of them. So you can make a living there. It's it doesn't work like that here. So some of the things you talk about, in terms of, leveraging the supply chain stuff, it just gobsmacks me that you would be dependent on that one supplier. But
well, it is true. And you brought up one thing a point that I wanted to make, and that's that there seems to be a trend towards personalization. That was one of the tips that I recently published in a 21 Insights for 2021 by executives in manufacturing and technology and supply chain, and that was one of them. Is personalization and mass customization is one of those pieces that's it really has to do with pivoting to the customer's changing expectations. But one of the things that I wanted to make sure we got in here is that, Diane, I know you had some thoughts on when you turn to the distribution side of things and the partnerships. You said you've been seeing some, what's been evolving on that front, as you've been looking into that.
Yeah, Lisa, I have two things. I'll start with the distribution question, and then I'll add my second point. But as far as logistics and the distribution side, I've been working with clients on projects on the warehousing side, and how do they assess, for example, a freight forwarder, freight partner, and what I've seen is really, are your partners, your third party value add partners, are they treating you transactionally, or are they treating you like a strategic long term, alliance partnership? And so I think there's been kind of a shift in maybe pricing or conversations on how do you ensure that you have obviously your logistics set up in place, but making sure it's for the long term and making sure you have strategic supplierships. And then the other thing I just wanted to add, Lisa and David and Evan, is we talked about all the different types of partnerships between the clients and suppliers, employees, and so on, but we haven't mentioned our strategic relationship with ourselves. And I think one of the interesting things that has come out of this pandemic, and what I heard on earlier this week on a call, is saving our health or being aware of our health has been a #1 priority for us out of this pandemic. So it's interesting to see the shift in just healthcare and people who are interested in taking care of their health more. And it's great to see overall.
It's true. And I think it's going to relate to the career changes. Go ahead, David.
Yeah, I'm sorry. There's a big shift in mental health too, particularly. Not just physical health. There's a really big shift to mental health. And I think that's a really positive thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have seen it affect our ability to find top talent and retain top talent, because as folks are realizing that they want to have a healthy lifestyle and they want to have a career that's meaningful, and they have more ability to transition with a vertical or hybrid approach, I think it's just going to make us have to get to a place of being an employer of choice, a shipper of choice, a customer of choice, a supplier of choice, because there's no other way to succeed.
Well, interesting you talk about shortages in the technology space, particularly because there is so much volume going on and there's so much demand for new systems. The problem is that the large software vendors have expanded the functional footprint of their products so much, but what they have not done is built the infrastructure underneath for qualified people and people who understand the product and have the capability to apply that to a business. There's a massive gap there at the moment, and I've got a couple of projects on for myself at the moment where we're trying to resolve that exact problem and finding the right people with the right skills who can understand the business and apply the techniques and the tools of the system is very, very difficult at the moment. So, I seriously believe that with everybody that's doing these new system implementations at the moment have got some serious challenges ahead of them because they just most likely do not have the right people doing the job.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm seeing the same here. So if you can believe it, we're getting close to the top of the hour. So why don't we go around, and if we had one or two takeaways, what would we like to leave our audience with, and what we'd like to be thinking about? So with that said, Evan, I'll start with you. Do you have a key takeaway you think that executives should be thinking about here?
Well, I think the key takeaway is the concept of, the relationship building. When a crisis hits, you look after the people that have looked after you. So that matters. And building relationships has got people through this pandemic. Continuing to build them will allow you to grow and prosper. And for goodness sake, always look at your manufacturing operation through the eyes of your customer. Don't allow it to be efficient from the point of view of the employees or the business. Allow it to be effective from the customer's experience.
Absolutely. And how about you, Diane? Do you have a takeaway that you think we should leave with?
Well, I'll just say that for the first time in a year or so, I feel that things are starting to stabilize. I'm feeling the stabilization and seeing the growth, and so excited for what's to come. But I think overall, just like Evan said, it's as this pandemic took effect and we were building relationships or holding on to relationships throughout the last year. I mean, those can tell you those are the priority relationships you want to continue on to, and make sure that you're taking care of those people that were around during the difficult, challenging times.
I think that's absolutely true. And how about you, David?
Well, I agree with all of that. I guess the thing I would impart is you've got to remember that relationships are two-way. There are two parties to a relationship, and you need to make sure that your contribution to the relationship is of value. I think one of the big area where a lot of people are letting that down is so many companies are just not even doing business 101 correctly. They can't give the visibility that's needed. They can't give the information that's needed to make the relationship work properly. So, focus on business 101, which then flows through to making sure that you've got the right metrics. And most companies have got the wrong metrics. They're creating the wrong behaviours. And because they've got the wrong behaviours, they're not necessarily a good contributor on their side of the relationship.
Absolutely. Well, and I would wrap it up with saying that the supply chain has become strategic. Now, it should have been strategic all along, but the end-to-end supply chain has become strategic. That doesn't mean that every element of it is strategic for every company, but the topic is strategic. You should figure out what it is that's most impactful for your organization, and garner your resources around those items that are going to contribute to, as Evan said, your evolving customer conditions, so that you can grow your business, and then, as we've all been talking about, scale effectively. With that said, I'd like to offer our free download of an ebook that our global experts in supply chain, SIG, put together. It's available on Amazon, and it's also available for free download on the SAC website. And it's thriving in the current business environment, why the supply chain is strategic. And we will send a link to that with a link to the video of this session today. So hopefully you'll join us again. We'll be doing another webinar in May, and so stay tuned for whatever topic is of top of mind to executives in businesses throughout the world.